the the Digital Accessibility Legal Summit, we kicked it off last year in Anaheim, California, and we had our second one this year. We were supposed to have it in Washington, D.C. in April, and obviously COVID interrupted that plan, as it has with so many others in the different industries. But today I just wanted to go through the various slides and see how it impacts all of us, and then specifically people with disabilities, obviously a target audience of the work that we do. All right, as all of you know, I do Accessibility in the News every week. And so one of the first things I started to see with COVID hitting is, if you look in March, we started to see a shift down, and then of course in April in the number of national news and international news articles. And that was obviously impacted by the different news outlets that I track. They started tracking COVID versus accessibility. And so we saw a decrease in mainstream articles from a national and international standpoint, and then a overall decrease in lawsuits because the courts were closed. And then we saw an increase in COVID-19 articles, as you can see in April and May, and that's continued into June. Those they've actually starting to trend off now in June a little, because I think the mainstream press are kind of back on top of their writing, and obviously COVID still plays into that. And then an increase in accessibility courses, webinars, and conferences, specifically the DALS 2020 that I was part of, which was very well attended. We were surprised as many people stuck with it when it went online. And then, of course, a decrease in conferences and training that are in person. And then the one thing that I track at the bottom of Accessibility News every week is the accessibility statements that companies pop up talking about the status of their website and how accessible it is. So a decrease in that, starting to see that trending back up. And so what that told me is that companies were paying more attention to posting things about COVID on their website than they were about updates on their website related to accessibility. So I think we're getting back to a kind of a normal in the accessibility field. The courts haven't opened back up yet, but that's obviously slowly going to happen. This chart was an interesting one, relative importance in 2020 so far. And so coffee flatlined way up at the top. Car usage, I think all of us know what that's like. I just looked at when I filled up my car for gas, and I think it was 2 months ago. And then the internet usage obviously went up. Shaving, as you can tell on the right-hand side, that's me post-COVID. Shaving is something that a lot of us stopped doing. Alcohol usage, of course, that skyrocketed as it does in any type of turmoil. And then toilet paper uses went up and then went down mysteriously. And then sweatpants, and the use of those obviously was a hot item. Okay, now to the lawsuits. One of the things that I've been doing for the last 4 years is tracking closely the lawsuits in our industry, because that fuels the work that we do in the accessibility side of the business, and then certainly on the e-learning side when it comes to schools and Department of Education. And so there was a slight decrease at the end of, well, actually from 2019 to 2018, there was a 0.09% decrease. And this is a chart that Safest Shaw, and Safest Shaw is one of the leading defendant law firms in accessibility. They have a big human resources group, and this falls under their human resources ADA. So it was a slight decrease, not significant, and we've certainly haven't seen any decrease in our activity. And then the one that I think are more important is what happened in the first quarter of this year versus last year. Again, the numbers were off, 528 cases. These are federal suits related to ADA Title III, 528 this year versus 633 last year. So a slight change. If you look at the ADA activity specific to the Department of Justice, that activity just continues to go through, and that never really slows down. You know, I can't make the blanket statement that lawsuits are, economically protected, because they're not. Obviously, COVID-19 and pandemic has impacted various industries, like medicine, like nobody ever thought it would. And then from the court standpoint, the ADA has slowed down a little because the cases have slowed down. But you can see from this, there's been quite a bit of activity since I just went back to February. So they continue along at a good pace. And then if you look at, some of the major cases, the National Federation of the Blind and two blind individuals went after the Social Security Administration for not having access to kiosks. So that was a big case that was settled. And then MIT, this has been a case that's going on 4 or 5 years, similar to Harvard with the National Association of the Deaf. And they, in March, had given approval for an agreement. And then just this past week, I got an update that MIT is even starting to challenge it a bit as far as establishing that it was unfair as far as the settlement. So that one's not dead. We thought it was settled, and it continues. And then first quarter, again, on the corporate side, we saw a lot of activity related to mobile app and native apps, and as far as blind people having difficulty accessing websites through their mobile phones. And obviously that's a tremendous amount of usage on the iOS and the Android side for people who have visual impairment. And then the second one is related to widgets and overlays. There's been a fair amount of activity from a legal standpoint in the first quarter, and it continues into the second quarter of this year. And so there's a lot of technology that is out there that has been scrutinized, and it's being scrutinized from a legal standpoint. The item on the bottom, although defendant's website contains an accessibility widget, there are still many errors present. This widget requires disabled users to activate and learn how to use the widget by going to a third-party website to access the FAQs, dictionaries, and user guides. And so this is right from a demand letter, and this is a very recent demand letter. And so I'm expecting to see a significant amount of these as we move forward, because there are more and more overlay and widget companies that are launching. And then the second quarter 2020, we had a lawsuit out of Pennsylvania with an Australian, they're actually an online site for Flight Center is the name of it. And they got sued out of Pennsylvania for related to Inaccessible website. That's a very recent one. And then there was the case out in California, which was interesting. This circuit court said that the plaintiff, Peter Strotnick Sr., he's a vexatious litigant. And so what they have said is they're basically taking away his rights to do that, and from both a district court and a federal court standpoint, because he's been so annoying with the number of cases that he's filed, which obviously impacts our industry. And then the one with the National Federation of the Blind, 5 high school students taking college boards, and access to them became a problem specifically related to the pandemic. It's related to the students getting approved accommodations to which they're entitled to. And these are blind and deafblind students. And so this is going to have some ramifications as we move forward, because of so much that has gone online. Is, SATs being taken online, LSATs being taken online, GMATs being taken online, MCATs being taken online. And are these platforms accessible? And for a lot of these, that they're not. And this is testing more and more companies in online testing services as to whether or not they can make them accessible quickly. And then the other one was the Social Security Administration. This is an interesting one. And this is all related to four of those, which actually makes no sense. You ask everybody to go online, and then you make them go online, and then you make them fill out paperwork, and you make them mail it in. And then the other big one was in Michigan. Federal court in Detroit approved a consent decree that orders the state of Michigan to provide accessible absentee ballots to blind voters, which is a very important one as we approach the campaigns in November. And that gets written about week after week, and I track that in Accessibility in the News. And then the last one that was of note was the McDonald's, as the title says, beats an ADA class action over drive-through access. The interesting finding was that the violation of the Americans with Disability Act finding Tuesday that the driving itself is not a protected major life activity under the ADA. Now, there's talk that that's going to be challenged, but that's true with so many of these lawsuits. Is they don't just die; they have different iterations. And then Governor Cuomo, this has been widely written about. The state of New York was sued related to the briefings that he did every day. And then the judge, came back after the suit and said that without an in-frame ASL interpretations, plaintiffs are, as a practical matter, unable to access benefits to which they are legally entitled. And so That one is been playing out in New York, but there's other states, and even the White House has been challenged on their ability to have sign language interpreters and ASL interpretation going on with their press conferences. So I think you'll hear more of that as that happens in the coming months. And then the Coalition of Disability Group demands access to New York inaccessible absentee voting. This is another voting one. This is related to the state agency with discrimination against voters who are unable to independently and privately mark a paper ballot due to print disabilities, including blindness, low vision, or physical disabilities such as paralysis, dystonia, and tremors, which is a large percentage of the population, especially in New York. But again, you'll see more of these type of suits as we get closer and closer to Election Day. So the U.S. courts closed down. It was closing, cancellations, and restrictions. And this was across both state and federal. The shutting down of courthouses, the restricting of the courthouse access, and then continuing trials, canceling non-case related activities. And then in 39 states and districts of Columbia, court systems on a statewide basis directed or encouraged judges to conduct hearings remotely by phone or video conference. So that was a major change. That's not typical with courts at all. And so they've been kind of muddling through that. And the cases have been backing up, and that is going to continue to happen until everything's fully open. And no one's quite sure when that will be. In the Supreme Court, for anybody who has followed that, on May 4th, they historically had a hearing of arguments by telephone, which was a first, and anybody could listen in from around the world. The interesting thing is, and I think we've all experienced something similar to this, one of the justices did not mute their phone during one of the sessions, and you could hear them using the bathroom in the background, and so they were quickly asked to mute their phones and not to have that happen during future sessions. So these types of cases will continue to be heard, and again, as we slowly open back up, we'll start to see more of the status quo from the standpoint of courts. And then the U.S. Department of Justice, this was an interesting one. As of this week, it was reverted back to its status. They had halted the issuance of a right to sue amidst COVID-19 pandemic because of the concern. First of all, all their employees are working from home. But secondarily, the onslaught of suits, obviously, that was something that they were concerned about. So it started March 16th and ended June 16th. And so I won't say it's business as usual with the Department of Justice, but they're certainly shifting back to some normalcy. And then again, the Department of Justice, the Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights issued a statement related to protecting civil rights or responding to the coronavirus. And that reiterates that discrimination based on race, sex, religion, and national origin and disability and other protected classes continue to be unlawful during the public health emergency. And the statement also provides information on how to report civil rights violations and obtain additional civil rights resources. So those are important items, obviously, for people with disabilities. And as we move forward, the items that are listed in the second bullet: access to housing, schools, benefits, services, jobs, and information, among other things, and disability or other protected classes. The U.S. Department of Labor, OSHA, has adopted a revised policy for enforcing OSHA requirements regarding COVID-19. This is a very, very important and widely discussed one. This is impacting companies all over the United States as we start to open up. What are the rules for safety of employees and safety of the work environment? And not just for people with disabilities, but employees in general across the whole spectrum of workplaces across the United States. And then the Department of Education. At the summit, Marcy Lipset spoke. Marcy's an advocate from Michigan, and she's the one who's responsible for literally thousands of complaints to the Department of Education and Office of Civil Rights, specifically for schools. And so Betsy DeVos early on had released these statements. The final one that I bulleted is really the most important one that I think, in instances where technology is not accessible or where educational materials are not available in an accessible format, educators may still meet their legal obligations by providing equally effective alternative access to the curriculum or services provided to the students. And so that really applies to the work that we do. Then industries affected. And there's lots of industries, probably all of them have been impacted. And it's just a question, how does it affect the accessibility work? And the online shopping as a whole. So Gartner, which is a very well-respected company, they've done a lot of writing since then related to accessibility, and their recent guidance to chief information officers. They specifically talked about the shifting of how and where we purchase goods and services and accessibility. And accessibility can mean two things: access online and then accessible to people who have disabilities. But specifically, the fact that we can no longer obtain most goods or services through any other means other than online changes the conversation around availability, accessibility, and security. Given the current climate, a large percentage of people who might engage with a product or service will now do so online. And I think every single one of us on this call can appreciate that. And then as more people shop online, they must take their websites and the companies must make their websites and apps accessible. And this is coming some specific information from Blank Rome, which is a law firm. And they talked about this early on with the shutting down of most physical business locations, like our office. Most of us, more than ever, are working, shopping, engaging in online activities, as is the case with the Zoom meeting rather than being at our office. And then the pandemic has not stopped plaintiffs' lawyers from filing lawsuits accusing businesses, websites, and apps of violating the ADA because they're not accessible to disabled individuals. And these trends make it imperative for businesses to focus on improving the accessibility of their websites and their apps and their courses, and you name it. If it's online, it needs to be accessible. And then this survey was done by DQ Systems. I think most of you are familiar with DQ. And then International Association of Accessibility Professionals and G3ICT, which is the parent of IAAP. So 83% reported that COVID-19 has raised the profile and importance of digital channels through their organizations. 62% have increased the awareness of the impact of accessibility on digital channels. 90% expect the volume of their work to increase or stay the same in the next 3 months. And then more than a third have heard reports that users with disability are having increased difficulty accessing services during this time of crisis. That's a big number, a third. And when asked how employees with disabilities are able to work remotely with the digital platform, 63% said that they have some or great difficulty. So that's basically 2/3. So those numbers are pretty staggering when you think about it. And again, that's the universe that we service with our line of business and accessibility and then e-learning. And then COVID-19 restaurant traffic has moved online. This was a slide that I had gotten early on, which was very eye-opening how, and I think most of us have probably used OpenTable to book a restaurant when we go out, and the OpenTable numbers literally dropped down to nothing because no one was going out. And the reason I show this is, how more and more is going to delivery and mobile apps and paying by credit card and paying online instead of by cash. And then navigating the ordering and the delivery apps and websites can be a huge challenge for people with disabilities. And more than half of Americans living with a disability say that their disability makes navigating websites difficult. So you can only imagine as they're forced to go online and try to order, because a lot of the restaurant websites just have never been accessible, and it makes it even worse now. And so if that's what you're forced to do, it makes it challenging. And then if you do venture back into restaurants now, typically they hand out paper menus, or they want you to go to their website and look at the menu. So if you're blind, obviously that doesn't help you at all. So it makes it even that much more challenging as we try to reopen in the way that commerce is being done at the restaurant level. Online banking, this is another industry that's been impacted. Obviously, the branches, a lot of them have shut down or have very limited hours and limited access. And so, again, if you're a person with disabilities trying to get banking apps to work for you, And it doesn't necessarily happen as easy as we would think. For a sighted person, they work fine. And we know firsthand with friends of ours who we've worked with that they struggle significantly with online banking as it is. But now that everything has been shifted in that direction, it makes it that much more challenging. And so, really, the key to this is moving businesses online into mobile apps. It excludes approximately 6.5% of American households, or 14.1 million Americans who are unbanked. So they typically pay by cash. Now, these individuals won't have a checking or a savings account and are essentially banned from businesses that don't allow customers to use cash. A certain percentage of that are people who are disabled. So there's a significant amount of hardship there, and companies really need to be addressing that. And certainly the restaurants and anything that's being delivered or being driven to kiosks. Prime example is Starbucks. Starbucks is pushing everything to be done by credit card. That makes it even a more challenging world post-COVID for people with disabilities. And then telemedicine. So I don't know if anybody on this call has gone to the doctor during the COVID crisis. And what that means today is probably a telemedicine visit. And that is something the industry has been pushing for years. And then all of a sudden COVID comes along, and all of a sudden it gets approved as a way to see patients. So the American Medical Association, pushed that through. Medicare and Medicaid started to pay for, and private insurers, they started to pay for these visits online, which is not something they typically had done in the past. And so all of a sudden, everything is online with them. And so from that perspective, if you've tried using it, not all these platforms are the easiest to use, and they're not all created equal. And I can tell you from looking at a bunch of them, they are certainly not accessible. And so from that standpoint, anybody who has any visual impairment and anybody who's not technically savvy, they will struggle with these platforms. And so again, these platforms, they didn't have much usage in the past. All of a sudden, it's like Zoom. They all of a sudden had this big tick up in usage. Now they're in the mainstream world, just like Zoom is trying to fix things that they had as far as shortcomings in their platform. Telemedicine is in the same boat, and they need to be able to adjust and adapt and make things accessible for any patient that would potentially be using these platforms. And then wineries turn to online sales. Well, wineries is another industry that it saw a huge increase in online sales, a 267% increase week ending May 9th. And that's year-over-year increases, which is a huge amount. And then shopping carts are brimming at wine retailers and on Drizzly, DoorDash, Instacart, and other mobile apps. And again, there's the word mobile. And shoppers are now clicking on it and tapping their favorite wineries, or they're discovering new ones. And this is an interesting quote from a gentleman out in California. E-commerce was coming for the wine industry, whether the wine industry wanted it or not. It just got expedited by COVID-19 companies and services that are now mainstream. But there was a lawsuit with Wine Enthusiast Catalog's website for not being accessible in February. So the lawsuits in the wine industry certainly haven't stopped. And I think this certainly opens our eyes to say that, okay, if you are going to be shopping more for wine online, there's going to be the possibility of more lawsuits for wine companies. So I'd say we keep an eye on that. And then hotel owners. Okay, hotels have been a target for plaintiffs' attorneys for quite some time now. And right now, they're slowly starting to open up. And actually, across the country, and not just the country, across the world, a lot of hotels have taken the opportunity to do certain upgrades to the hotels because the foot traffic obviously has been down significantly. And as they start to reopen, they've had to make changes at the front desk as to how they greet visitors, and the same thing with payment. They'd like to do a credit card payment rather than any type of cash payment. But it's been an area of concern for people with disabilities for years, is access to hotel websites and then access to accessible services at hotels. And so with COVID-19, this becomes even more exacerbated from the standpoint of, if I'm a blind individual and I think I'm getting an accessible room, is my whole roadmap to and from the hotel and in the hotel going to be an accessible one plus a COVID-19 germ-free one? And so it's someone who is not sighted doesn't have the ability to see whether or not there's precautions being taken that are taking place. And so this is something that's being scrutinized even closer now from the disability community, is how the hotel chains evolve and how they make their rooms and their facilities that much more safer for disabled people, specifically to germs, and then on top of it, the normal accessibility issues. And then how COVID-19 has impacted persons with disabilities. I've touched upon that in a bunch of these slides. This is specific to PWDs. And these are articles that I had read specific to COVID-19. You know, the first one, despite the strides that have been made in recent years, various digital and other accessibility challenges remain around the world for people, including those who are blind, deaf, and have other disabilities, as far as getting information and services that they need. Then some of the challenges have become even more pronounced since the start of COVID-19 pandemic. COVID-19 has created an opportunity and an entry point for us to have these conversations, because the government tells everybody to go online for services, but the mobile apps and websites are typically not accessible to people with disabilities. And unemployment. Well, unemployment's been obviously something in the news. These numbers were updated as of today. And so 29.2 million people are still claiming unemployment insurance, according to the Department of Labor. This is down from 29.5 million last week and from 30.2 million in the week before. And this quote from Antonio Guterres from the United Nations: people with disabilities who faced exclusion in employment before the crisis are now more likely to lose their jobs and will experience greater difficulties in returning to work. Yet, only 28% of the people with significant disabilities have access to benefits, and only 1% in low-income countries. So you can see that group has been greatly impacted again as a result of COVID-19. And then PWDs, as far as negative impact from COVID, a global disability survey for over 500 participants reveals that people with disabilities are being impacted by COVID-19 at a higher rate than those without a disability. 51% of the people with a disability have either lost a job, been laid off, or furloughed. So look at that number, 51%. That's a huge number. Or believe they'll lose their job in the next 90 days, compared to 28% of those without a disability. And then people with disabilities are more than 2 times as likely as those with disabilities to think they will need to find a new job outside of their current industry in the next few months. Sobering numbers. The question is, when people with disabilities or anybody go to state websites specific to COVID-19, this was released by the publication, The Markup, that every state in the United States launched at least one website with updates about the virus outbreak. And unfortunately, the majority are difficult or unusable for visually impaired users, according to a survey conducted by WebAIM. So 41 of the 50 state pages they surveyed contained low contrast text, which can be challenging for users with low vision, including seniors who are at the highest risk in an outbreak. And so that's not good. And then navigation was another challenge for users with visual disability. 31 of the 50 state pages contained empty links or buttons, which means a screen reader will not be able to tell the user what buttons do or where they're linked to. And so it makes most of these pages useless for people who have visual impairment. So it defeats the purpose of putting information out there. It's almost like the Social Security thing. You can't do it online. You have to fill it out and send it in. State unemployment websites. So this is a real big concern. That they've been getting significant activity, obviously, because of the number of people who have been laid off. But the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation reports that 1/3 of state unemployment websites are not optimized for mobile platforms such as smartphones and tablets. That's a big number, 1/3, which is a serious problem since roughly 20% of the Americans access the internet at home only via a mobile device. So again, it's this kind of an oxymoron. You know, you're supposed to go online and access it, but you can't access it. And then in addition, many of these websites are not designed to be accessible to people with disabilities, although more than 8% of these individuals are employed and 57% have internet access at home. And if you look at this is from the New York State Unemployment Office. I think a screen reader would have a field day with this. I mean, and you look at You look at state to state and they all look similar. And then before coronavirus, workers with disabilities say that employers didn't allow them to work from home. And then all of a sudden everything shifted and everybody was working from home. And really the big question people have is, will they continue to be able to work at home, and will they have the technology and the equipment to continue the teleworking? Because so many disabled people in the past have wanted to work from home and the accommodations never were given to them. And then teleworking for PWDs, this was an interesting one. Workers with a disability are more likely than those without a disability to work in service jobs, in transportation, production, and material moving jobs. According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, they are less likely to work in management, professional, and related occupations, which means they tend to not to be able to do telecommuting. And again, as everybody's been pushed to telecommuting and they're doing their jobs now telecommuting, the question is, will that trend continue? And can they continue to work from home on certain jobs? And if not, what type of accommodation is going to be made for them post-COVID as we start to evolve? And then this is related to the inaccessibility of the information as far as the deaf community. I mentioned it earlier with Governor Cuomo. The limitations of merely offering closed captioning subtitles are one such example. This issue has previously been flagged concerning the lack of ASL interpreters at the Donald Trump White House coronavirus briefings. And so, again, this bright spotlight has been shown upon a bunch of these press conferences that a lot of these cities and state and federal agencies just really weren't aware of what they needed to be doing when they ran a conference. And legally they're supposed to be doing it, and legally they haven't been doing it. These were some quotes that I thought were pretty interesting. Most, if not all, deafblind persons still need a deafblind interpreter to help them get all necessary instructions and informations when they don't have family support or where alternative communications methods have failed. The World Federation of the Deafblind urged this month, therefore, it's vital that our unique disability is treated with respect. And then Robert Cordana, the president of Gallaudet University, said, unlike hurricanes or other natural disasters, COVID-19 has required physical distance between people, but deaf-blind people rely on fixed physical proximity to communicate with the world around them. Cordana said, to be frank, there is no mechanism on a national scale to support deaf-blind in the current American healthcare system. And there's been countless articles written about deaf people with wearing of masks and how they do both sign language, and then they also read lips. And obviously, if you have a mask on, that's not a clear mask. They are at a severe disadvantage. And so that's something that's been addressed by a number of different people who have created different masks in different countries. A number of people have done it here in the United States, making it easier. Certainly doesn't solve the problem, but it makes it easier for them to communicate with other people. And then COVID-19 related litigation and implications. This is a boom industry. It's amazing the numbers. From a partner at Foley and Ladner, I would expect an uptick in the filing of ADA cases just as a result of the huge disruption of workforces across the U.S. and the sheer volume of people being terminated. So he's specifically talking about termination type lawsuits. And then National Federation of the Blind, when there was very little planning time involved on a quick ramp up time, we're very concerned that blind students are going to struggle. And that has been the case based on everything that I've read and seen. Legal experts say there's no existing playbook to combat lawsuits that could result from business reopening amid the virus. Labor advocates worry that the blanket immunity would create disincentives for even law-abiding employers to protect their workers, producing a race to the bottom for workplace standards. Small business owners are the most worried about legal consequences and are stocking up on protective gear like masks, gloves, sanitizer, just to open up to do business. And then as of yesterday, this is a site that I track pretty closely, there were 2,818 COVID-19 related complaints tracked at Hunt and Andrews Kurth complaint tracker website. The largest complaints were 512 civil rights cases, 680 insurance cases, 200 labor and employment cases, and 136 education cases. This is since the beginning of COVID. What are we middle of March is when we started to shut down. Here we are, middle of June, and we already have 2,818 filed, and that's as of yesterday. I'm not going to read all these, but this gives you a litany of litigation that are being filed across the United States. I thought one of note was, 2 states, Missouri and Mississippi, are suing China. And then the Chinese people are suing the American states in courts as an act of revenge for mounting litigation against China. And then the schools and universities, there was one just filed recently, Harvard students class complaints, seeks refunds for online courses. The airline industries have been hit hard, amusement parks, the gyms, just recently Gold's Gym and 24-Hour Fitness and filed Chapter 11 protection in LA Fitness, maybe next, lawsuits within nursing homes as far as the way patients were treated. Cruise lines, big names like Target sued for misleading claims on germ-killing ability of hand sanitizers. And then Albertsons, this is a recent one, price gouge customers in the midst of the pandemic. And that's just one page. Again, I said there were 2,818. That's just one little section of them. Texas made the news, tries a pandemic first, a jury trial by Zoom. So this is interesting to see how things progress with virtual trials. No one knows exactly how successful they're going to be and how many courts are actually going to do those, but it's a significant shift in the way we do legal cases. And then the future of ADA title websites. I mentioned earlier how so much has gone online, that COVID-19 has tilted the world of commerce decidedly and perhaps irrevocably toward a model where the fundamental point of contact between consumer and business is online. I mean, our world as a company and everything we're doing right now is online. And then you multiply that across all companies, all state, city, federal agencies, all schools. That's a tremendous amount of activity online. And then as a practical matter, these changes will translate into a myriad new websites, novel digital content, and increase in online consumer traffic. Each new website, however, is a risk for each one represents a potential lawsuit. And that means in our industry, specifically every time a business creates a new digital interface with the consumer, there'll be an active bar of litigants examining that website for shortcomings. I mentioned the wine industry, I mentioned the hotel industry, I mentioned the restaurant industry, I mentioned the food industry. All of those are potential. And then you get school, and then you get federal, and you get Social Security, you've got unemployment offices, you name it, they're all potential targets. And so while the world is unfortunately uncertain whether there'll be a follow-on wave of COVID or waves of COVID-19, one thing that is certain is there'll be a substantial waves of COVID-19 based litigation in the United States. One such wave will almost certainly target the multitude of new web-based service offerings necessitated by the pandemic. And then ADA compliance trouble. How do you reopen stores during the pandemic? And this is something that stores and restaurants all over the country are struggling with. And we've seen the statistics in Texas and in Florida as we reopen, the numbers of cases of COVID is increasing. And so restaurants and retail stores and small businesses struggle to reopen or continue operations online, consistent with public health recommendations on social distancing and protection of customers and workers. You'll find that their task gets complicated in many ways by the requirement of the ADA and related state laws, which everybody's paying attention to, or they'll have to pay attention to. And so future web accessibility litigation. These are my kind of predictions with court filings, proceedings starting to open up. If past trends in accessibility cases continue at the pace we've seen in the last several years, which we started this off with those safer short charts, then it's likely we will see a spike in cases that will continue through 2020. And as businesses and schools continue to move more content online into digital formats, then it's likely we will see more accessibility complaints, meaning the OCR complaints and lawsuits in general.